And so they did several tests on him. And after the test, the doctor came in and he said, I am sorry. He says, but all of our tests show that you have not one, but several diseases that are going to lead to your death, an early death. And that they're going to get worse and worse and worse. And he says, well, Doc, what can we do about it? And the doctor said, well, I don't know, but the only thing I know is that what we're going to have to do is put you in a room all by yourself, separate, all by yourself, and you're going to have to eat pancakes and veal cutlets for the rest of your life. And the fellow looked at the doctor and he said, Doc? He said, I like pancakes and I like veal cutlet. He says, but why am I eating them and them only? He says, how are they going to help? The doctor said, help? He said, they're not going to help. He says, it's just that they slip under the door easier. If you've ever been in isolation, you might understand that. And if you ever had leprosy, you might understand that, because that's what we're going to be looking at this morning. A truly compassionate miracle. Matthew chapter 11, verse 5. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cured, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is preached to the poor. Now, all the healing miracles that Jesus performed were acts of compassion. No doubt about it. However, there is a difference in people's conditions. Most of the conditions mentioned here were permanent conditions that didn't get any worse over time. If you're lame, you're lame. If you've got a broken leg, well, it might heal eventually. But if you're deaf, you're deaf. If you're blind, you're blind. So we understand that. But there's something a little bit different about leprosy. Leprosy. In Jesus' day, it was the dreaded disease, much like cancer is today. It was the dreaded disease. And its damaging effects were just much like cancer today. They really were. It kept getting worse until it killed you. It started off just little bitty spots on your eyelids, on the palms of your hand. Little bitty spots that grew and grew and grew. Now, they became scaly. They gradually would spread over the whole body, and in its later stages caused the body to be greatly disfigured. Greatly disfigured. The effects of the disease were not the only dread of leprosy. Not in Israel. In a lot of other countries, that was it. But not in Israel. Because you see, in Israel, the lepers were ostracized. They were banished. They were excluded from their town, and they were excluded from their family. They were made to live apart from everyone else except other lepers. Can you imagine? They could never hold their children again. They could never touch another family member or anyone else. And no one touched them. They were isolated from life and sentenced to live a very lonely existence, except when a few of them gathered together. Now, many of the people in Israel considered this disease to be an awful punishment from God. And perhaps this was because of some of the Old Testament stories. The Old Testament stories of Miriam and Uzziah and Gehazi. And Miriam became leprous when she rebelled, she along with Aaron, her brother, rebelled against their other brother, who was the leader of the Israelites, and they tried to take over. And she became leprous. Moses, in all of his kindness and gentleness, was persuaded to pray for his sister. And he did. But God's response was, listen, 7 days she's going to be outside the camp. After that, we'll let her back in and the leprosy will be gone. So Moses' prayer was answered. And then we had Gehazi. Gehazi was the servant of Elisha, and he was there present when Elisha healed Naaman. But Naaman offered him silver and gold and brand new clothes and all kinds of things. And Elisha refused. But after Naaman had gone for a little bit, Elisha's servant Gehazi went to Naaman and asked for some gold and silver and clothes. And he got them. And he came back. And Elisha took a look at him and he said, I see what you've been up to. You know that's wrong. And because you've done that, you are going to be leprous for the rest of your life. You are going to have Naaman's leprosy on you. And so indeed, that's the way it was with Gehazi. And King Uzziah was struck with leprosy during his tirade against the priests. And there was about 80 priests who approached him, and they told him, they said, look, Uzziah, you have no right to burn incense in the temple of God. Only the priests can do that. Well, that just made him mad. You know how kings are. And he lambasted them. And in the middle of that tirade, leprosy came on his forehead and began to spread, and he was isolated for the rest of his life. And his son took over the kingly duties. They knew of all of this, and so there was this tendency to say, hey, God causes leprosy to be on people. It is His punishment. But you see, in some cases, yes, specifically, but not generally. The people were making the same mistake that Job's good friends made about him. Because when Job was covered with those sores from head to toe, and he scratched and scraped with old broken pieces of pottery, and he ached and he was just miserable. And his friend said, hey, it's because you've sinned and you've done wrong in the sight of God. They didn't realize that it wasn't God that caused it, but it was the mischievous nature of Satan that caused it. And so indeed, they made a mistake. And so did the Israelites when they said that leprosy was all caused by God, because it wasn't. It's like other sins and other diseases and other maladies. So, and of course, we know about Job, don't you? Poor Job, even his wife told him to curse God and die. He was in bad shape. But listen, the lepers, they had the disease, and not only were the lepers ostracized, they had to tear their outer garments, and they had to yell, unclean, unclean, anytime somebody came near them. They were not allowed near anyone. And that's important to understand when we go to read about Jesus' miracles here. Very important to understand. The dreaded disease. And except for the general statement about Jesus cleansing the lepers, and aside from the mention of Jesus staying at the house of Simon the leper without ever saying that Jesus healed him or anything else about it in regard to that, only that another issue came up, and we're not going to get into that today. But the point is, the only other two times that we find leprosy, or the story of leprosy, is about one man who had leprosy and 10 men who had leprosy. Now, the one man who had leprosy is told about in all three of the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John doesn't even mention leprosy. Not at all. And the second one we'll look at is the 10 lepers and the story of how Jesus healed them. And let's look first at one leper in need. Matthew chapter 8, verses 2 through 4. A man with leprosy came and knelt before him and said, "Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean." Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. "I'm willing," he said. "Be clean." Immediately he was cured of his leprosy. Then Jesus said to him, "See that you don't tell anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer the gift Moses commanded as a testimony to them." Now, Jesus had already been healing people. So this man has heard of Jesus at least, and possibly seen Jesus from a distance, healing other people. The thing is that he knew about Jesus, and he trusted Jesus even though he really had no relationship with him. But he trusted him enough that he was going to go see Jesus. And he was going to break the law in doing it. He was going to break the law. And how did he break the law? He came up to Jesus right in front of him. You had to stay away. And he didn't. And he fell on his knees, and he put his face to the ground, and he begged Jesus and said, "Listen, Jesus, if you can, I know that if you really want to, you can heal me." And of course, what did Jesus do? Jesus' compassion is always there, and his power is always there. The power and compassion of God were in Jesus Christ. And through his power, he healed the man. And he healed him because of his great compassion for the man and for the disease that he had. He really felt for the man. Listen, don't ever think when something happens to you, diseases, accidents, no matter what it is, don't ever think that God doesn't care. Even though he doesn't instantly make you well, don't ever think he doesn't care. Because he does. He cares. He cares most of all to save you from the worst malady known to man. And he saves you instantly from it. And that's your sin. Your sin. God cares. Cares enough that Jesus died on the cross for you. God cares. So don't ever think that he doesn't. Now, I have to understand something about Jesus. Jesus, he had a great respect for the law. The Pharisees accused him of breaking the law. Jesus did not break the law of God, but he challenged the interpretation of the law by the Pharisees. And it was their interpretations that he went against the grain with, not the law of God. Here we've got a leper. Jesus heals him, and what does he tell him to do? He says, you go and do this legally. You report to the health officer, to the priest, and the priest will pronounce you clean. Because you see, the law says that that's the requirement. The priest must declare you clean. I healed you, but he'll declare you clean. And so he sent him. Now, I want you to understand something about Jesus' compassion in this. Jesus' compassion for this man was the very fact that anyone else, what would they have done? They'd have rebuked him. Have you ever done something wrong, or even something a little bit wrong, and you go to someone, or you're there at home, and usually what happens? Somebody says, you shouldn't have done that. You messed up. They're not real quick to give you a hug or anything else until they've rebuked you first and told you about your badness. But Jesus didn't do that. He didn't try to find out whose fault the leprosy was. He didn't try to find out anything else. He didn't rebuke him and said, hey, listen, you're not allowed to come up here. You've broken the law coming up and kneeling before me. You're too close. But Jesus didn't do that. Jesus' compassion was so much for this man that what did he do? He reached out and did something that no other human being would do. He reached out and he touched that leper. He put his hand on that scaly skin. He put his hand probably where there were sores with oozing pus and disease coming out of them. And he put his hand there because he was compassionate. He didn't have to touch the man to heal him. And we'll see that when we look at the next miracle of the lepers. He didn't have to, but he did. Why? Because that's the nature of the compassionate Christ. That's the nature of the God we serve. And that's how much he cares. He reaches out and touches us in our misery. In our misery. You see, it was pure compassion, kindness, and gentleness that prompted Jesus. It was the loving kindness of God reaching down from heaven to touch his hurting child and say, I love you and I care about you. And that's what it was. Now we want to read this same story as it's recorded in Mark, and it adds a couple of things to the story that we've seen. Mark chapter 1, verses 40 through 45. A man with leprosy came to him, and here's where we find out that he begged, because Mark tells us. Matthew didn't say anything about the begging. He just said he came to him and asked him. Mark says he begged him on his knees. If you're willing, you can make me clean. And here we also find out about the compassion, because Matthew didn't mention it. But Mark does. He said, filled with compassion, Jesus reached out his hand and touched him. I am willing, he said, be clean. And immediately the leprosy left him, and he was cured. Jesus sent him away at once with a strong warning. See that you don't tell this to anyone, but show yourself to the priest and offer the sacrifices that Moses commanded for your cleansing as a testimony to them. Excuse me. Now, Mark adds another thing. He tells us something that Matthew didn't tell us. Verse 45. Instead, this man with leprosy, he went out and began to talk freely, spreading the news. As a result, Jesus could no longer enter a town openly, but stayed outside in lonely places. Yet the people still came to him from everywhere. See, the cure was immediate. Jesus wasn't showing off. He wouldn't say, hey, look, I've got this power, I can do this. Instead, what did he do? He said, don't tell anybody. But of course, Mark says that the guy told everybody. And also consider this. The Pharisees were always trying to accuse Jesus of breaking the law, but he wasn't. He wasn't. Again, he only broke the rabbi's interpretation of the law. So the story is proof positive that Jesus had great respect for the law, and it also demonstrates his great power and his great compassion. Now, Mark tells us that the leper begged Jesus to heal him. And he tells us specifically that Jesus had compassion on the man. He even tells us that he didn't even obey Jesus. Did Jesus give him the leprosy back? No. Perhaps maybe Jesus was more understanding than we are. Because if we had told someone not to tell anyone, we'd get upset if they did. But I think Jesus probably understood something that was going on here. Why would the leper tell everybody and do what he did? Because he was so excited about getting rid of that leprosy, he couldn't hold it in. So we can't blame him. He just couldn't hold it in. So, out of excitement, he went out and he blabbed everything to everybody. Now let's read Luke's version of it. Chapter 5, verses 12 through 15. While Jesus was in one of the towns, a man came along who was, this is what Luke adds, covered with leprosy. When he saw Jesus, he fell with his face to the ground and begged him, Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean. Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. I am willing, he said, be clean. And immediately the leprosy left him. Then Jesus ordered him, don't tell anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer the sacrifices that Moses commanded for your cleansing as a testimony to them. Yet the news about him spread all the more, so that crowds of people came to him to hear him and to be healed of their sicknesses. So Luke says the same thing, but he doesn't accuse the leper of spreading the word. He just mentions that it was spread. And he does add one important point, perhaps because of his occupation. Luke was a doctor, so he gives us a real update on the condition and the progress of the leprosy in this man. And the progress was, it wasn't little dots. It wasn't on his hands. It wasn't just on his head. It was all over his whole body. It's in late stages. Late stages. And listen, leprosy, it starts on the skin. And it gets deeper and deeper and deeper until it goes all the way down to the bone. And then it begins to rot the human being from the inside out. You can imagine the smell of people rotting. And that's what they were doing. And that's about where this man was. But Jesus touched him. He had that much compassion. That much compassion. So the power of Christ and the compassion of Christ are seen in this miracle of healing this one man from leprosy. Now let's look at the 10 lepers, and they're only mentioned in one place, and that's in Luke. Only in Luke, only record. Luke 17, chapter 12 through 19. As he was going into a village, 10 men who had leprosy came to him, and they stood at a distance. Notice, these fellows are obeying the law. They're doing what they're supposed to do. They're standing at a distance, and they're calling out in a loud voice, "Jesus, Master, have pity on us." And when he saw them, it didn't say when he heard them. It says when he saw them. And you know what that infers? That means he saw their condition. They weren't just figures out in the distance yelling. He could see the leprosy in them. He saw them. "Jesus, Master, have pity on us." And when he saw them, he said, "Go show yourselves to the priests." And notice this, as they went, they were cleansed. Jesus didn't touch them. Didn't come near them. Healed them long distance, or at least semi-distance. One of them, when he saw he was healed, came back, praising God in a loud voice. He threw himself at Jesus' feet and he thanked him. And he was a Samaritan. And Jesus asked, "Were not all 10 cleansed? Where are the other 9? Was no one found to return and give praise to God except this foreigner?" Then he said to him, "Rise and go. Your faith has made you well." Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem, where he was soon going to be betrayed and arrested, tried, and crucified. However, on the way to Jerusalem, many things happened, including his meeting these 10 men on the border between Galilee and Samaria at a little village, just outside the village, because they probably weren't allowed in the village. Now, the 10 were a mixture of Samaritans and Galileans, which is understandable. That's where they were. And we don't know how many of each made up the group. However, we have a tendency to think that there was only one Samaritan. Why? Because it mentions that the one Samaritan came back. Well, there might have been 9 Samaritans there and only one of them came back. We just don't know. And it doesn't matter, does it? If it mattered, that it told us. Still, it's a large group that meet Jesus. Now, they were a little more law-abiding than that one leper because they kept their distance and they yelled to Jesus. And again, Jesus showed his deep respect for the law when he told them to show themselves to the priest. And notice, when were they healed? As they were going. So they start off. We don't know how far they got. And all of a sudden, they look at themselves and they say, "Hey, I'm clean." Now, we don't know if all the rest of them went down to the priest or where they went. But one of them came back to Jesus. Why? To say thank you. Might want to just slip a question in here. When was the last time you told God thank you for something besides your food? When did you tell him thank you? Now, again, they were a little more law-abiding. And Jesus showed his deep respect for the law. And when he told them to show themselves to the priests, he meant it. And again, you have to notice, when were they cleansed? On their way. Now, Jesus touched one leper, but he just spoke to these 10, telling them what to do. And they were healed. And the lesson here turns on Jesus' power and on Jesus' compassion. And now, this is what we've been looking at. And Jesus flips it over to our point of view. He flips it over to the thankfulness of humanity. Jesus has died on the cross for us. Are we thankful? Jesus has done many things for us. Are we thankful? Here's only one man who was thankful.